Dead Art Studios painting chat. Back for the new year, and today we're discussing plein air painting or plein air painting, and that just means painting in the outside, in the open air. And we're going to talk a little bit about how it came about and how it's not quite as simple as it maybe first seems. But first, let's have a look at the painting I'm doing. This one I started just for the new year in my last video, which was like, hello, it's 2026 and all that. And it's an apple. Now, it's not outdoors. The weather's freezing. I'm not going out there. We're in Britain in winter. I'm painting inside. And I've got an apple. It's golden in the middle. And then I've got these darker colours, which have kind of got ultramarines, a little bit of sienna and umber, and a bit of green gold as well. And we've been using an iridescent gold for the apple itself in the centre, make it a bit shiny and a bit different. And we're using golden acrylics, and in this case it is actually gold. Right, so I've got a few brushes. We'll get started and we'll talk about plein air painting. Where did it come from? I kind of just assumed there'd always just been plein air painting, and in some ways I think that's probably right. But when you sit down and sometimes have a little read of a Google article, your mind starts wondering and you think, oh right, yeah, this is kind of how it is. And then the more you think about it, the more complicated it gets. And that's the thing about history in general, isn't it? Right, let's start with some ultramarine. On the top of this apple here, I want it to curve down and just refine the shape a little bit more on the back there. It's a bit too horizontal. And just on this edge here and here. So I think what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll just darken all around the apple, and then we can slowly blend out that background when we've got a bit more definition of the apple itself. We might do a bit here to try and sort of get this a bit more blended, and then we'll start looking at the apple and imagining where the light is. I want this to be the most golden bit here, and then I want to try and create some depth using the shading, and so it's going to go darker as it goes back. Let's get a bit of blue ultramarine onto my little lid here, and a little smidge of water. Now, when I started this painting, it was a lot wetter, but now I want to get some slightly thicker layers on, I think. So I don't want it too wet, he says, as he gets it quite wet on there. Water goes a long way in acrylics. So I was reading an article about how plein air painting came about, and it basically said it was due to the advent of portable paint tubes made out of tin, like this one here, that you could fold and roll, and the more empty they get, you roll them up and it comes out. And I never really thought about it. I kind of assumed, oh yeah, well, I just thought it'd always been around, but it hadn't. Obviously, before paint was, oil paint at least, was made with the pigment and the oil, the linseed oil. You have to grind the pigment down, and then you have to mix in the oil. And a lot of the masters would basically have people to do this for them, but it didn't really lend itself to going out and about and painting. So what you do is you go out and do studies, drawings, sketches, and maybe some light watercolours and things like that, and then you'd come back and you would do your painting in basically the studio. And in some ways that's possibly about why in this sort of, there was always this thing called the hierarchy of art in sort of the Renaissance period, and landscape painting didn't feature that highly in that, strangely. And maybe that's because you couldn't actually go out really well and sort of just actually see the landscape as it was. But in 1841, John G. Rand, an American inventor and painter, although I haven't seen any of his paintings on his little Wikipedia article, it's kind of just a little bit short. It's like, yeah, he made the tin paint tube, tried some other things, and it didn't really go to plan. Let's put the paint on at the bottom first where it's already blue, just to see what we're dealing with. There we go. I'm going to try and do just some quite broad strokes and just try and get that edge a bit sharper for the apple, a bit more apple-y shaped. Really should wear my glasses, but we're at a distance where I can see. So yeah, John G. Rand, he invented the tin paint tube, patented it, And this led to a bit of a revolution. So the earliest group of painters, so the story goes, was the Barbizon School in France, of course, Paris. And that included artists like Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, Theodore Rousseau, and Jean-Francois Millet. And they went out and they started using the paint tubes out in nature. It allowed you to get these very quick strokes down and try and see what's going on. And that's kind of where Impressionism started to emerge from. Because obviously oils still take a long time to dry, and the way you use them in the studio will probably have different to how you have to use them outside. So you'd have different styles. So you'd be getting it down quick, you'd be using looser brush strokes, you'd be maybe getting quite impasto and throwing layers on top of other layers before the weather changed, before the scene moved and stuff. And that led to Impressionism, the sort of height of plein air painting as we know it. Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Sicily, and especially we think of Monet, don't we? He had a little boat with a nice little roof where he'd go out and he'd sit on his boat and he'd paint the surrounding areas in Paris or wherever he happened to be in France. Provence was a big area for the Impressionists as well, especially for Pissarro and our friend Cézanne. Now, they created a whole new style, and that is where we then see modernism come from. Picasso loved Cézanne's work, and it got more abstract towards the end of his career, and Picasso kind of carried that on and created, in our mind, or at least the story goes, modern art, the beginnings of modernism, along with Georges Braques, and perhaps we need to think about Matisse and things like that in between, and some of the Fauvists and things like that. And so you're quickly left with this idea. You're like, oh, so somebody invented the paint tube, then some people went out and started painting outside, then Impressionism happened, and then Cézanne sort of like messed around with Impressionism and started to turn it more into shapes and forms, and then that became abstract. And then Picasso, he did that even more so and abstracted everything even more, and then we got modern art. And that's kind of a nice story, isn't it? Except for I don't think it's quite that simple. Right, let's actually try and cut into the top. I'll get this bit around here. Now, one thing I haven't got that these painters did was good strokes. A stroke that knows what it's doing, I would say. I just sort of wander around, and it'd be nice to be like boom, 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 stroke, 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 and then you go in different directions and sort of layer it up, and like maybe more like this. Let's try that. But then I want to have the apple shape as well. Right up there a bit. It's a bit too there and there and there. It's a bit chunky. See, that was too much. Let's see if we can rub it off a bit. There we go. And yeah, so you're like, okay, that's a cool story. But then I started thinking, I thought, well, watercolours, when did they come around? And a quick check. Watercolours were around for ages before the paint tube. And now were watercolours stored in little cakes and blocks, and you had a bit of water to them. And well, hey, you could paint anywhere. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, does that mean that weren't people painting outdoors for years before? Yes, they were, and they were doing it with watercolours, but there was a subtle difference. The subtle difference was that watercolours are not regarded as highly in the world of art and painting, in that Renaissance hierarchy of art, as oils. Oils represented sort of establishment and permanence, and they are more archival and they do last longer, and that's kind of why. And you paint on panel and canvas, which was tougher, and you could have bigger pieces, whereas watercolours were often done on paper, and they're often done quickly and outside, and often done by women a lot of the time. And of course, historically, people have been pushed to the sides for various reasons, and being female is definitely one of them. And so watercolours weren't really held in this high regard, and they were kind of used, but more for the studies and things like that. But Turner, of British fame, was painting with watercolours and was also doing plein air, quite a while before a lot of this thing was going off in Paris, and also was getting abstract towards the end of his career. His watercolours, famous for getting more abstract towards the end, his late watercolours, and also his late paintings, the one with the train, I forget its name, and you know, it's heading off and you can barely see any of it, perhaps because his eyesight was failing like mine is these days, and also perhaps because he was talking about the end of an era, the beginning of steam coming in, and the sort of end of an era that he knew and grew up in, and so like blurring into the next zone. Also, maybe because he had similar theories and ideas to Cézanne, but because it wasn't in Paris, then it wasn't recorded in art history. And I'm like, well, why is that? I mean, we've got Gustav Klimt at the same time. He's over in Austria, and he is doing amazing things, flattening all sorts of decorative things, mixing with architecture, which doesn't go down very well in Paris. It's not very pure. And his painting is arguably some of the best painting of that era, if not, in my opinion, the best. And it's like, well, why is it all Paris? Why is everything going off in Paris? And it's anti-establishment as well, because it's the breakdown of the establishment. But you have to kind of think of it. Paris had the Salon, and it also was very central to art in general. And London was important, but it didn't have the same vibe going off. Britain was generally had more dispersed authority around the country. It wasn't all about London, although some people might disagree with that. And yeah, the other thing that London had, or Britain had, was like democracy quite a long time before. So, you know, Paris and France had the Republic and several republics, I learned, and you know, it failed. You had the First Republic and in the French independence, and then you had Napoleon take it over and creating an empire, and then you had like 3, 4, or 5 republics. It's hard to make sense of. I only had a brief look, and in some ways that made Paris very central because it was very authoritatively focused to that area, and you had the Louvre and the Salon and all those kind of things. And basically, if you weren't getting into the Salon, then that was a scandal of sorts back in those days. And of course, painters like Cézanne weren't getting into the Salon, and Monet and Renoir, they were laughed at, and sort of the critics, which is another important part of this, sort of brushed them aside. But that ultimately led to their rise. And then you're left thinking, well, why is it always Paris? I mean, it is partially for that reason, but also another important thing that played a part in this was historians like a story, and also a lot of historians and art historians, and something else that's very important in the sort of conventional art history is the rise of America and the search for American art. You know, with Pollock, for example, the famous American abstract expressionist Joe Mitchell later on, and really the people over there as well, the critics and stuff, were collecting art. And a lot of the American collectors, and you know, you think of the Guggenheim and stuff like that, they were collecting French art, and they were collecting Picasso, and they were collecting stuff from there. And in some ways, that sort of refocused everything even more down into Paris. The reality is, it was quite a lot more spread out. You had people like Sargent, another British artist, painting outside and doing plein air. And, you know, not Constable so much. He did the more sort of traditional idea of just doing sketches outside and then going in and finishing off in the studio. And so there was things going off everywhere, all over the place, by men, women, people of all backgrounds, all ethnicities and things like this. But what you end up with is this kind of vanilla tale that's very sort of paint tube, Impressionism, Picasso, Ode to American Art, Abstract Expressionism, Pollock and Friends, and then maybe on to Basquiat, maybe on to Andy Warhol. And that's kind of the first story when you get into art history. That's kind of the story I've wove to myself, sort of created. And then the more I think about it, the less it makes any sense. It was never a narrative, not such a defined narrative. It's so spread out, and I think that's interesting in itself, how culture works or how we understand it. Right, we've done a lot of chatting, we've not done a lot of painting. So let's try and get this apple shaped up a bit more. It's still a bit, on this side, it's a bit, I don't know, a bit long. Let's get up here as well. I just want to get this bit out here, maybe like that. Let's just try blurring this paint out a bit more. Well, the apple looks a bit skinnier now. We'll end up with no apple, won't we? There we go. Just trying to, I mean, I would like it to be a bit less regular. You don't want to just a round blob for an apple. Yeah, I think that's looking a bit better on that side. Let's try and fix this side up a bit more. Yeah, it's looking a bit better maybe. Let's try and pull this in. Now this bit, it's kind of high. I do kind of wish that went out a bit more there. We can put more paint in. Let's paint where we think it would go. And so it's interesting how all these little things fit together. And of course, if you're writing an article to go onto the Google feed or something like that, you know, it makes sense to simplify it and tell a story. We want to tell stories, don't we, as humans? But it's not really always a particularly accurate depiction of what actually was happening. A story is all it is, really. Let's just get up here. Okay, I think with this bit down here, I'm not a fan of. Right, I think we've got a better shape of the apple. And in a way, the story, if we want to keep it as a story and not a reality, the story even feeds into the kind of painting I'm doing now. If we look, I'm just doing an apple from imagination with crazy colours. I'm using gold in the middle, and I'm kind of just doing what I want, aren't I? And that is following on a little bit because we have the idea of the academic, the Renaissance and the academic and everything being very structured and rules-based, and then those rules getting broken down. The paint tube comes and the rules get broken down. And here I am now, just doing what I want. But on the pile of a long history of people kind of doing what they want, but recognizing that the people before them did things, you know, and relating to that and feeding off of that, nodding at it. And it's kind of led me to where I am today, or where we all are, you know. And when you paint now, some people like to do their hyperrealism, you know, like their human inkjet printers and just go and they do these amazing things. And then you have people who just use their emotions and do amazing things. You have people working in stories and fables and cartoons and and there's pop culture, there's design, there's graphic design, there's architecture, there's different mediums, there's people using resin, and it all is just feeding in together. It's really interesting how it works. So, I think I've got the shape of the apple. I think I've said that about 3 times. I think what I'm going to do is work on it a bit more. I've made a promise to myself to actually paint and not just chat this year. Work on it a bit more and we'll come back and have a little look at the end. Back, been painting for about an hour, and what I've been trying to do is to know where the apple is, but not have it sort of there in hard lines. So I've been trying to soften the background, make the background a little bit more complicated, a little bit less patchy, and overall more even, and then have an idea of where the apple is and it kind of blending into the background rather than having edges. So I think I've done that. It's quite nicely done around there. I quite like the shape, and it's quite soft on the edges, but you can see it. And then I've just put a little bit of the gold in there and then down there as well. I think the problem areas is this is a nice little bit of shadow here, but that needs to be softened somehow. And I've got to think about what kind of strokes I want to use to create that effect. I think in the background something a bit more dappled. And then I've got to think about whether I want a sort of horizon line and a background and a foreground in that sense, or whether I just want it to all blend in or not. And then I just need to bring in some more of the details of the apple and make it a little bit more golden, because it's supposed to be a golden apple. So a good session, I would say, and I'm looking forward to carrying it on. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.